So with Lincoln's election, we had the secession of the South. The South Carolina legislature called the convention to take the state out of the Union as soon as the news was telegraphed. Within 6 weeks, the other six states of the lower South had also called conventions, state conventions, that is. Within by February 9th of 1861, 3 months after Lincoln's election, commissioners from these states, meeting in Montgomery, Alabama, met to adopt a provisional president. A political examination of the South finds that there were three basic positions of secessionists. There were immediate secessionists that believed that each state could secede on its own without waiting for the action of the collective South. Many non-slaveholding and slaveholding Whigs were swept into the immediacies camp by the perceived threat to white supremacy and slavery. Most supporters of this position were from high slaveholding counties. The second position were the cooperative secessionists. They urged delay until the South could formulate a collective response to Lincoln's election. The cooperationists drew their greatest strength from upland counties with fewer slaves and from areas that had supported Bell or Douglas for president. But the cooperative secessionists were divided amongst themselves. There were the ultimatumists, who demanded a federal slave code for all territories, a pledge not to interfere with the interstate slave trade, a repeal of personal liberty laws by northern states, and compensation to slaveholders for property lost through northern failure to enforce fugitive slave laws. And then there were conditional unionists who wanted to give Lincoln an opportunity to prove his peaceful intentions. The question is whether secession was a revolution or a counter-revolution. Hysteria was sweeping the South. The desire for some of change, the greed for many for excitement, seems to have overridden the reason of men and left them at the mercy of passionists. Many secessionists expected the revolution to be a peaceful one. After all, you got to remember, only about 12% of white people in the South actually owned a considerable amount of slaves. The remaining, 15%, just owned a couple that was probably like close, like two or three, maybe just one. So all the seceding states, even though they hoped that the revolution was going to be a peaceful secession, they knew that most revolutions succeed only by violence. So if you're praying for some type of revolution, you also better be preparing for some type of violence. All the seceding states strengthened their militia and encouraged the formation of new volunteer military companies. These are called Minutemen. As they declared themselves out of the Union, states seized federal arsenals and forts to arm and equip these military organizations. So they took Brown's plan, and in the South, they seized the federal arsenals. One of the first acts of the Provisional Confederate Government was to authorize an army of 100,000 men. Armed revolt against an established government by definition is illegal, but most secessionists insisted that their action was legal and constitutional. More perplexing was the logical contradiction of a revolution for the defense of slavery. This was the oddest revolution in history. This speaks to the backwardness of the South. For in premise, this was a revolution for the greater security of injustice. The extinction of slavery was what the South feared generally, but a greater concern to most secessionists was the possibility that the Republican Party might have some attraction for non-slaveholders, especially in the border South and in the upcountry. In those regions, the yeoman farmer was alienated from the planter elite. To prevent such a division, secessionists tried to invoke Herrenvolk democracy to remind yeoman farmers that the racial stake that they had in defending slavery. Because remember, not all white men owned slaves, but they did all own white skin. So that was the underlying message. Newspapers would print articles with this type of messaging. Lincoln's election shows the North intends to free the Negroes and force amalgamation between them and the children of the poor men of the South. Thus, we will never consent to abolition rule. The idea was that The democratic liberty solely exists because we have black slaves whose presence promotes equality among the free. Southern political skills and Southern domination of the Democratic Party had given the slave states disproportionate power in the national government. From 1789 until 1861, meaning from 1789, the country was started in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. So from 1789 to 1861, the majority of the speakers of the House, the president pro tem of the Senate, and most of the Supreme Court justices had come from slave states, and at all times they had been the majority on the Supreme Court. Also, the majority of presidents of the United States had been slaveholders up until 1861. Lincoln's election foreshadowed an end to all of this. It was a signal to the country that it had turned a decisive political corner toward a future dominated by the ideology and institutions of the North. The Northern response to secession was that they expected the secession fever to run its course without taking more than one or two states out of the Union. Then the good sense and basic loyalty of the South would reassert itself. This was a misreading of the situation in the Lower South. With President Buchanan in the crisis, he took the crisis a little more serious, but he was in a difficult position. He believed that the crisis was precipitated by Lincoln's election and was therefore Lincoln's responsibility, but Buchanan had nearly 4 months left on his term. So, any proposals for compromise only included Northern concessions to Southern demands. The South wasn't willing to concede anything. So we have to ask, what was Lincoln's position? At that particular time, Lincoln, he made no public statements during the period between election and inauguration, but he instructed Republicans to entertain no proposition for a compromise in regard to the extension of slavery. Launching the Confederacy was to be a process. Delegates to the Confederate Constitutional Convention met on February 4th in Montgomery. They hammered out a provisional constitution in 4 days, mostly copying the United States Constitution, with the exception of it explicitly guaranteed slavery in the territories, forbade protective tariffs, and outlawed congressional appropriations for internal improvements. All these features were designed to strengthen states' rights. The Upper South voters in Virginia, Missouri, and Arkansas elected large majorities of conditional unionists to their state conventions. Arkansas and Missouri conventions vetoed in March to reject secession. North Carolina and Tennessee voters rejected the calling of a convention. Upper South unionists made clear that their loyalty was contingent on 2 factors. The incoming Republican administration must offer guarantees for the safety of slavery and must refrain from coercion of Confederate states. So Lincoln takes his position, and the day after Lincoln's inaugural address, Major Robert Anderson delivered news to the newly elected president that the garrison at Fort Sumter would be forced to evacuate unless resupplied within a few weeks. So Fort Sumter was a nearly completed fort on an island at the entrance of Charleston Bay. It had become a symbol of Union presence in the South. When South Carolina succeeded on December 20th, 1860, the fort was still unoccupied. U.S. soldiers in the area were stationed at Fort Monterey, an obsolete fort on a spit of land across the bay from Sumter. The commander of the garrison was Robert Anderson, who reported that Moultrie was indefensible against attack by land. On December 11th, he had given him discretionary orders to move his command to Sumter if he thought that an attack was imminent. South Carolina officials had already been demanding the surrender of Charleston forts, and military companies were arming and drilling. After dusk on December 26, Anderson secretly spiked Monterey's guns and transferred the garrison to Sumter. President Buchanan ordered the reinforcements sent to Anderson. The Army decided to use a merchant vessel, Star of the West, instead of an armed warship to minimize publicity and provocation. When the Star of the West entered the bay on January 9th, the shore batteries opened up on her, scoring one direct hit before the captain turned around and headed back north. The North erupted in anger, while South Carolina made accusations of federal aggression. New demands for Sumter surrender also appeared. The war did not come immediately. The Buchanan administration worked out an informal truce with South Carolina that preserved the status quo for the time being. Secessionists in other states persuaded South Carolinians to wait until the Confederacy could complete its organization. So basically, the Confederates fired that first shot on Sumter. That's what starts the Civil War. And we're not going to get into that Civil War. If you want to get into Civil War, you can purchase the book. I mentioned what the book was in part 1. But we're not going to get into the war. We're going to skip right to Reconstruction. Because right now we got the perpetrators. We got the legislation. We know who the judges were. We know who the presidents were. Who was helping perpetrate this crime of slavery. Now we have to get to Reconstruction to see, what's been going on since slavery ended at the conclusion of the Civil War.